So welcome everyone. Today we're going to be talking about FEMA map amendments and revisions or letters of map changes in general. I'm Ceil Strauss. I'm the state floodplain manager, been with the floodplain program over 20 years and was area hydro about 10 years before that. And Madison Rogers. Madison, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Madison Rogers. I'm a floodplain engineer in the floodplain mapping and modeling unit in the DNR, and I do a lot of FEMA mapping and modeling projects, and I'm going to help talk about the letter of map revision part of the presentation.
So I'm going to turn off my camera for most of the presentation here so we can focus on the presentation and keep good bandwidth. So today's agenda, we'll be talking about the various FEMA map amendment and revisions that, as this mentions here, they're collectively called letters of map change or LOMRs. And we'll be talking about all those different types and a little bit about the submission process for each of those types. And we'll end with a few resources. And I'll be focused on what are called the MT1 types of letters of map change. And Madison will be talking about the bigger, more difficult ones, the MT2 revisions that include letters of map revisions, the conditional letter map revisions, and physical map revisions. I'll be talking about the other MT1 situations. Their letter of map amendment, a letter of map amendment out as shown, letter of map amendment in a map floodway, which is actually called a LOMR-FW, conditional letters of map amendments, and conditional letters of map revisions based on fill, and the letter of map revision based on fill or LOMR-F. So we'll get into more detail about all of those. And a note that the conditional ones are situations where it's a proposed project. The project isn't built yet, and you're basically asking FEMA, if we build it the way we're proposing here, would you approve it? And then you'd have to come back later after it's built to actually get the letter of map revision based on fill or the other versions of the LOMRs. So in this slide, we're pointing out that those in red, the LOMR-F, CLOMR-F, the LOMA involving a floodway, and those MT2 actions all require acknowledgements from the community. They require that the community acknowledgement form is completed. And we'll talk about that a little later, but just letting you know up front that those are the ones that the community has to be involved in getting those approved. All the ones that aren't red are ones that they can submit to FEMA and the community won't know about it during the application process. So what's the difference between the MT1 and MT2s? The MT1s are generally simpler, more straightforward. They're still on, they're not changing the flood insurance rate map, which is what FERM stands for, the flood insurance rate map. And it usually when people are getting one of the MT1 LOMRs, it's because they want to remove the insurance requirement, because if your building is in or touching that 100-year floodplain, that special flood hazard area, and you've got a federally backed loan, the lender must require you to get flood insurance. And the MT1 is the different kinds of LOMRs you can get to get the insurance waiver. MT2s are much more complicated and a lot more technical requirements, but they result in an official change to the FEMA map, to that flood insurance rate map. And the community must be involved because it's the map that they're administering for floodplain regulations. And we're not going to go a lot into FEMA maps or finding BFEs in this presentation. We've talked about that in some of our other trainings, but just be aware that the main parts of the floodplain that we're talking about here, this is a detailed study. The 100-year floodplain, the special flood hazard area is this whole area here. The part in the center with the red and light blue hatching is the floodway, which from a regulatory perspective is very restrictive, and we'll mention the floodway in a couple situations here. And most of these cases, especially the MT1 cases, they're involving flood fringe areas, which is the light blue area. You don't need a LOMA or those other MT1 actions in the medium risk area, which is usually the 500 year, or if you're outside of the mapped area. So some of those LOMIC options. Let's take a look at a few situations. Here's a building that you can see it's not touching the flood area, the 100-year floodplain, and the parcel's not touching either. But sometimes when there's a home sale or building sale going on, the determination company that figures out whether the building's in or out of the floodplain, they'll put a buffer. So once in a while, you'll get a notice that that building's officially in the floodplain and flood insurance is required, but it's clearly not in the floodplain. Or another example that's probably more common would be this building that we can see it's not touching the floodplain, but the floodplain is touching that parcel. And since they usually do an overlay of the floodplain on the parcels, and if it touches the parcel, they'll tell people that they must get flood insurance. So those are cases, or in this case, it actually is touching. So there they would have to get a letter of map amendment if they want to show that they're out of the floodplain. But for these yellow cases, they usually can send a map to the lender that clearly shows the structure's not in that high-risk flood zone. Sometimes the lenders will say, I want something from FEMA. So then we'd be talking about a letter of map amendment out as shown. Some of the other things we'll be talking about would be a letter of map amendment using LIDAR, the more typical letter of map amendment where a survey is required, and then we'll talk about letters of map revisions based on fill before we turn it over to Madison to learn more about LOMRs and CLOMRs. So if the lender says you need flood insurance, but you can see on the map that it's not in the high-risk floodplain, then you could show that to the lender. From what we understand, most of the lenders will accept a map that shows more clearly that building's outside. But some will say, I want something from FEMA. And I like this example because it reminds me to talk about the 500-year floodplain, or that medium risk floodplain. That does not trigger the mandatory flood insurance requirement. So in this example, it might be close to touching that 500-year, but what they're looking at is whether it touches the floodway or that flood fringe, or if it's an area that's not a detailed study, it would all be this bluish color on the more modern maps. Sometimes you'll look at county sites to get better, they usually have better aerial photos than what's on the FEMA viewer and in the official flood insurance rate map, the FEMAs. But FEMA contractors say they cannot accept just a map from a county site, that officially they're looking at that FEMA map, but the county maps can often give you some good supporting information to make it clear if that building is out of the map floodplain. So here's another example of a building that you can see is out. That'd be eligible for an out as shown. They'd first try and send the map to their lender. If they don't accept it, want something from FEMA, they'd be applying for the letter of map amendment out as shown. And there's that example that I was showing, but using the FEMA. And even on the FEMA, you can see that's clearly not touching that floodplain, the high hazard floodplain, the floodway or the flood fringe light blue. This is showing an example of using a county site that's got a very nice clear aerial photo with the floodplain there that you could attach with your FEMA if the FEMA is not real clear on the boundary. So submitting a LOMA OAS out as shown, for all of those MT1 actions, you're going to need legal documents, a recorded deed or plat, which you'll usually talk to the county about getting a copy. They're going to want to see where the property is, and like to see on a fermet, having where the property is plotted there, marked up on the fermet. There's no fee for FEMA's review, but there may be other costs in gathering that information, especially in the cases where you need the survey. FEMA responds within 60 days after all the information has been submitted. They tell us that the majority are addressed within 35 days, just to give you a feel for how long it takes. And if it's close, you're not sure, you can always submit to FEMA asking for that out as shown determination. Since there's not a fee, it doesn't hurt. And this is just showing where you can go and get the paper copy of the maps. And for this and some of the easier LOMA cases, there's the MTEZ form, which is, like the name implies, is going to be a little bit easier form. You don't have to fill out quite as much on the form. So when you're eligible to use that form, we encourage you to do that. But it is only good for single lots, whereas if you're applying for multiple lots, which sometimes somebody's applying for like a whole block or subdivision, then that you can't use the easy form. It's only for single lots. So let's say we're back to this situation. It is in the floodplain. You can't just show a map to the lender that it's out, because it's not. It's, even if it's just nicking the building, that's in from FEMA's perspective. So then we're looking at the letter of map amendment, which is basically a letter from FEMA stating that based on better elevation data, that it is not elevated on fill and it's officially not in the floodplain. It's officially above the flood elevation. And because the FEMA map is not perfect on the boundaries, the map was wrong in this specific situation. And here's another way to look at it. Here's your natural ground. And that lowest ground touching the building, what they call the lowest adjacent grade or lag, has to be above the base flood elevation. Now in Minnesota, we're used to having our minimum lowest floor at the regulatory flood protection elevation. And sometimes people think that to get a LOMA, you have to be above our RFPE, which adds at least a foot, and then sometimes adds stage increase if it's along a river or flowing area. But to get a letter of map amendment, it's a federal document, and that only has to meet the federal minimums, which is being above the base flood elevation. The other thing is this is natural ground, and that means whatever the ground was on the day that the first FEMA map showed this area in the floodplain on the maps. So if there was filling done in the 40s or 50s, that doesn't count as fill. That would be considered natural ground. But if after the map comes out, someone goes and puts fill around the building, that's fill. That is not natural ground. So when you apply for a LOMA, you're either applying for the structure itself, for the full lot, or for a portion of the lot. And if you're applying for a portion of the lot, you need that meets and bounds survey. So as I said, for LOMAs, you're going to have the choice of the MTEZ form for some situations. Again, single lot and a typical LOMA, you can use that MTEZ form. Otherwise, you're using the MT1 form, which does have additional requirements. And so you can use it for all LOMAs and conditional LOMAs. You must use it for anything that involves fill and for multi-lot. When you're submitting that LOMA request, you have to have a survey showing that lowest adjacent grade normally. You need to know the base flood elevation or the 100-year flood elevation. Again, you need that legal documentation, and that's one of the most common things that people forget to submit is that deed or plat. And then there's some other weird situations that don't come up very often. If it's an AO zone, which is more common up in northwestern Minnesota, or if you're asking for the partial lot removal, then you need that meets and bounds. Again, no fee, but you might have you likely will have costs for the survey, and if you hire someone to prepare that submission. And again, they must respond within 60 days. So this is what it would look like that you would get. And it shows you, you've got the LOMA up here, and it's officially saying that this determination was that the structure, in this case, was determined to be outside of the special flood hazard area, another word for the floodplain, and that the new zone is considered zone X, that less risky zone. And they'll usually show the lowest adjacent grade elevation that they use for the determination, or the lowest lot if it was for a portion of the property or the whole lot. In old cases, they showed the BFE that they use, the flood elevation they use, but for at least the last 10 years, they haven't been showing that unless it was a denial. Then they show the BFE. Now, a few other details here when you're applying for a LOMA. It actually can have a basement if it's an older home built before you had your local floodplain regulations, existing non-conforming building, as long as that lowest adjacent grade is above. And again, there was no fill involved, then even if it's got a basement, they can get a LOMA. However, if you've got an attached deck or stairs, in addition to looking at the lowest adjacent grade at the building, they will look at the lowest adjacent grade for support for the structure like this. So in this example, here's the BFE, and that support is below the BFE, so that would not be eligible for a LOMA. Now, someone could go put in some new supports here and detach it, have that surveyor come back and verify it's not attached anymore, and this is the lowest adjacent grade for the building, and then they could get a LOMA. And we have seen people do that, end up with a very close deck accessory structure, but it's not part of the building. And why does FEMA care about that? They started really cracking down on that probably 15 years ago. And here's a picture. This was taken in 2007 in southeast Minnesota there at Minnesota City. The stream came along and flooded here, and you can see this deck and there's other decks, and that deck fell off. It ripped off some of the siding and parts of the building and caused more damage. So FEMA was seeing more of that around the country and started really cracking down on, if it's an attached deck or stairs, we're going to treat it as part of the building. Another unique situation for LOMAs is if it's a LOMA in a floodway. And it's probably hard to see online there, but there is a building here, and this is the floodway. But you can see based on these contours that this is a floodway that is not following the contours very well at all. And it's showing a building that's clearly very high in the floodway, which of course is wrong. So person can apply for a letter of map amendment, but when it involves a floodway, that community acknowledgement form is going to be required. And we'll get more detail on that in a few slides. So in this case, they did get their letter of map amendment, and it will be, instead of being a regular LOMA on the form, it calls it a LOMR-FW for floodway. Another unique situation where you won't get a LOMA is this one here. You can see the contours were just kind of going along here, and this BFE contour would have been out here. This building would have been out of the floodplain, but when they built, they really wanted that walkout, and they dug themselves into the floodplain. So if they hadn't done that, and the floodplain was nicking the building, they could have gotten a LOMA, but not anymore. And you can't go put a ridge of fill back in and say, oh, never mind that excavation I did. That doesn't work. How about if the house is really high? So here's a drawing that is showing that the flood level is way down here, and this is an older paper map example that we're showing. It's the paper, that old map is showing the building in the floodplain. And this is a case where people were not happy that they had to pay a surveyor to get a letter of map amendment. But as we got more of our LIDAR, our good elevation data available in the state, we worked with FEMA, and we've had the LOMA with LiDAR option for over a decade now. And basically, what you have to do is, here's an example where you can see all these contour lines. And here's the building. The floodplain is running across here. They're showing that building in the floodplain, even though they're clearly like 40 feet above the water. So to use the LOMA with LiDAR, you find the contour below the building that's not touching the building. And in this case, this is kind of close, so we might even go to the next one just to be on the safe side. But you need to be able to find that contour not touching the building below. We subtract a foot, and because of the accuracy of the contours, we subtract half a contour, and these are 2-foot contours, so we subtract a foot, and we call that the lowest adjacent grade based on LiDAR. And the FEMA reviewers will accept the term the LiDAR leg, lowest adjacent grade. So if that LiDAR leg is above the base flood elevation, then they're eligible to get the LOMA just using this map or a similar map and not having a surveyor go out there, which is much better than telling this person they've got to pay a surveyor to prove that they're not right in the floodplain. On our DNR lake and flood elevations online site, we do have the 2-foot contours and the floodplain overlaid. So here's an example where I used our lake and flood elevations online print option, printed a map with the site. I, in the comments, pointed out that I'm using the 1028 contour I can see is below the building. And I subtract a foot for my LiDAR leg of 1127 here. And that is clearly above the BFE of 1099, which was based on an upstream cross-section. And sometimes you need to do 2 maps to be zoomed in enough to see the contours next to the building. And then you also need a separate one that shows the upstream and downstream cross-sections to show the BFE if you're using those BFE lines for the A-zone cross-sections. And on this site, I went to try and make a map, and I realized it had been updated since I did the original slides here. And so you could have done the print of the map showing here's the downstream and upstream cross sections in the area. There's where I got that upstream cross section from for that building there. But now the maps have been updated and it more correctly shows what is the actual flood risk area. So now that person wouldn't have even needed the LOMA, but before they got their updated maps, they did. And we do have a video about using our LFEO site to make those kind of maps. If there's not already an existing LOMIC, an existing LOMA or LOMR-F, or if you don't have one in hand, check to see if there is one, either through your community or there are sites where you can and look for that. Actually, the FEMA's National Flood Hazard Layer is the best site to look for whether there's an existing LOMA or not. If there isn't an existing LOMA or LOMR-F, see if your community does have the as-built elevation, since if it was built after the community's first ordinance, the community should have that elevation documentation. If it appears high, you can go and check on our Mintopo site. Go to this little graph-looking thing, click it, you'll get this box option to do points or lines, and they can click around the building and see if it looks like it might be high enough to get a LOMA. And actually, even if you're not eligible for a LOMA, getting an elevation certificate, if you're required to get flood insurance, will help you get a better price. Conditional letter of map amendment is that they're reviewing the proposed building. And similar documents that are needed, but there is a fee involved in a conditional letter of map amendment. How do you apply? You can apply with a paper form, an online application, or with an electronic LOMA that only licensed surveyors and professional engineers who have gone through a process with FEMA and they're authorized to do a FEMA LOMA application. Their first one's audited and then randomly after that, but that PE or licensed surveyor who's gone through that process can potentially get an LOMA within a day after they have their survey information in hand. And it's not good for all situations, but for more standard LOMAs, it will work. And that is something you can ask the surveyor you're talking to. The online LOMIC site, this is what it looks like. You do need to get a login.gov account to do this. Just a little bit more about LOMAs, what I mentioned earlier. Still no fee from FEMA for the review, but of course that person doing the work for you would have a charge. And we do have an article about LOMAs in Water Talk from about 5 years ago. Common reasons for LOMA rejections would be that there's already a case in the queue. It's in a place where they don't have BFEs, or it's a zone V, a velocity zone, the coastal areas. And if it involves fill, it's not eligible. And if it's a conditional case, it's not eligible. You can get a refund for your flood insurance if after you get the LOMA, it won't be the full amount, but you can get a good portion back. So a little bit about when you've got fill involved, then you can get a letter from FEMA that you've elevated that building, you've reduced your risk, but it did involve fill. So here's just a drawing showing that the building's been elevated. It's above the base flood elevation on fill. And another way of looking at it is the map was correct. It was floodplain, but you've come in, you've met the local ordinance requirements. The lowest floor, the lowest adjacent grade are both above the BFE. Actually, the lowest floor, if it's a new building, needs to be meeting your ordinance, so that should be at your regulatory flood protection elevation in Minnesota.
Ceil,
another way to
interrupt you?
Sure.
We do have a question in the chat. Someone is asking about LOMIC applications, if they have to be submitted by the LGU or by the landowner.
It can be submitted on behalf of someone. I believe the landowner would have to sign the form, so the LGU can't just do everything without the knowledge of the landowner, but the LGU can definitely be helping with submitting that. And we do see quite a few of our LGUs have really helped people out and have talked about how it was actually one of the situations where people were really happy with their assistance instead of them telling them things they couldn't do. Again, a reminder that if it involves fill, you can't use the MTEZ. And one of the first questions is, has fill been placed? If yes, stop. You've got to use the MT1 form. So here's the required documents. You're going to need that panel that shows where the property is, that legal document, the elevation form, requires that community acknowledgement form, and there will be a review fee when there's fill involved because the map was correct, but you've done something to reduce the risk, so they'll charge for the review. The community acknowledgement form that I've been mentioning, that's what the form looks like. The section B is when it involves the regulatory floodway, so that applying for the LOMA when it's in a floodway, this is the part the community would fill out. But for talking about fill, it's going to be this section A involving the placement of fill. And let's zoom in a little bit here. And there's all this legalese. And basically what it says is when you're signing, you're saying it's not in the floodway. If it's a conditional LOMR-F, that it complies with the Endangered Species Act, it will have or has all required permits, and that the existing or proposed structures will be reasonably safe from flooding, and that you must be able to show that supporting information if FEMA asks. And this basically means that that lowest floor is meeting your ordinance. It's above the BFE in most of the nation, or it's above our regulatory flood protection elevation in Minnesota, or you've adopted a FEMA document called Technical Bulletin 10, and it gives some other options for meeting reasonably safe from flooding. So again, you're vouching that it meets your regulations, or your community's adopted FEMA's Technical Bulletin 10, and it follows that. If it's a pre-firm building, it's a existing nonconformity, and the lowest floor happens to be high enough, then sometimes people will bring fill around the outside of the building to get it above the BFE if there's a low spot. That's a case where they would be eligible for a LOMR-F just based on the BFE. And then a reminder that since 2001, when they came up with that Technical Bulletin 10, FEMA's form doesn't require you to show the lowest floor on the form for the surveyor. So the community is responsible for making sure it meets that lowest floor requirement. The DNR does check LOMR-F situations and will look at the application, and if we don't see documentation that what the lowest floor is, we will reach out to communities and ask, what documentation did you get? You signed this form. What's your proof?
See, we've got a question about the Endangered Species Act for those CLOMRs. Any guidance on that?
Boy, that's something we're working on getting more guidance, and one of our upcoming LGU forums is talking about the Endangered Species Act and some of the resources available. That's something that we're very weak on guidance right now, but you basically use there's a Fish and Wildlife Service area where you can see the information you need. And if it comes up in your case, Jason, if you've got a specific site where that comes up, we can look into it there for you and try and help you find the information. I will mention that getting the LOMR-F does not remove you from the regulated floodplain, and some of that is due to higher standards in Minnesota law. We actually say that it's got to be filled above the regulatory flood protection elevation, not just the BFE, and it's got to be contiguous with land outside the floodplain. We don't want islands that are considered not regulated in the floodplain. So again, the conditional would be they're proposing that building based on fill, and they're asking FEMA, hey, if we build it this way, will you accept this? Will we be able to get a letter of revision based on fill? A lot of times people will apply for this if they're not sure what BFE FEMA will accept. If it's a place where we don't have a detailed study, we don't have good BFE information, and they want to verify FEMA agrees with what's being used. It's similar documentation for that CLOMR-F. Again, requires the community acknowledgement form, and it does involve a fee. So how about this situation? Would this be eligible for a LOMA or a LOMR-F? No, the lowest adjacent's way down here, and it's not elevated on fill. This would be a legal option, an alternative elevation, but it would not be eligible for LOMA or LOMR-F. And then I'm just going to say a couple words about floodway development and turn it over to Madison. So in floodway, in Minnesota law, we're very restrictive about what's allowed in the floodway. That is our area where we really need the area open for conveyance. We don't want obstructions. We don't allow structures except for those accessory to an open space like a park shelter. And any grading that's done in the floodway, so trails or parking lots or new road crossings, they have to show that that grading will not cause any rise in the flood stage. And you need to have them do a no rise certificate. And if they can't show no rise, they're going to be required to get a conditional letter of map revision. And the if allowed is you can only get a conditional letter of map revision if you're not going to be touching any existing buildings, basically. And Madison will get into more on that. But our no rise certificate, here's an example of what Minnesota has. It's got to be signed professional engineer. That rise can be no more than 0.00, so 0.004 rounded. There's the link to the federal code. We don't want to see words like, well, it's close. There's hardly any rise. It's insignificant or minimal. That's not good enough. We're going to be looking for that 0.00. Sometimes you can use other standard engineering practices, like if it's a backwater area or if you're restoring the cross section. Here's an example of sometimes people think it's just net fill. And here's a cross section on a river, existing road maybe here. Here's the base flood elevation. Sometimes people think, well, I'm going to remove from here. I'm adding it here, no net filling. That's the same amount of fill. Well, no, you're taking something that is either on the edge of that floodplain, putting it closer to the river where there's more velocity and it's more of an obstruction. And in this example, it's actually from above the base flood elevation. So no, that's not acceptable. It's a conveyance that you got to be looking at. Yeah, and if you were taking from here and going that way, then that'd be a different story. So turning it over to Madison to talk about those MT2 actions.
Ceil went over those MT1 letter of map change types, and I'm going to focus on the MT2 letter of map change. So the LOMR, CLOMR, and PMR. And I'm going to try to list out the acronym as many times as I can, especially here in these first few slides. But if there's ever an acronym I miss, you can throw it in the chat. What's that one? Because there are a lot of them. So a letter of map revision is a letter from FEMA officially revising the effective flood insurance rate map. It shows a change to the floodplain or the floodway or flood elevations. So this is an example of what the letter might look like there on the left. Some reasons you might apply for a letter of map revision is if you're changing the flood discharges, so if there's any change in hydrology. An example of this might be there's more up-to-date gauge records or info on the hydrology compared to what is in the effective study. Maybe there's like a land use change or something that happened that changed the hydrology in an area. If you have modified hydraulics, so if you change the elevations in any way, you may need to apply for a letter of map revision. Anytime you're modifying the floodway, new bridges and culverts are common ones for letter of map revisions. When you're doing improvements to the channels, or if you're doing specific flood control projects, or if you have just better data or topography, you might also want to revise the maps. So the CLOMR is a conditional letter of map revision. It's very similar, but it's commenting on whether a proposed project, if built as proposed, would justify a map revision, a letter of map revision, or a physical map revision. We'll get into that later, but we'll focus on the LOMR part here. CLOMRs are required if there's an increase in the base flood elevation proposed. If there's a project that's happening and there's an increase in the base flood elevation, there's a requirement to complete this conditional letter of map revision because of the increased risk due to the increase in base flood elevation. Detailed study areas have that published base flood elevation, so that's primarily focused on detailed study areas for the conditional letter of map revision. And a reminder that once you do submit your conditional letter of map revision and then it's been issued, you also have to apply for a letter of map revision after the project is built. And you do that using the as-built survey data for the project. So assuming the project was built to plan, that would be really easy. If some things slightly changed, you might need to update the details from your conditional letter of map revision for your letter of map revision. And that it can be really easy if it's the exact same, or it can be a whole nother process of review if you have a difference in your project. A reminder, Ceil mentioned this a couple times too, that a conditional letter of map revision is not a building permit. It's a separate thing. Permits are not issued based on the conditional letter of map revision, and they don't change. A conditional letter of map revision does not change the flood insurance rate map. So it's not any effective change. It's commenting on whether the project would qualify for the change in the flood insurance rate map once it's built and the final LOMR is applied for. I am going to focus today when talking about this on more the application process of LOMR and CLOMR, and not as much on all of the specific what if this type of flood zone and this type of project kind of scenarios. This guide goes a little more into that, and there's a link here. It goes a little more into some of the details on specific types of projects and zones, and there's just a lot of kind of what if scenarios. So this is a great resource, and there's also Minnesota DNR staff are always happy to help with talking through does this need a LOMR? Does this need a CLOMR? For specific project types too. I was going to make these polls, but I think in the interest of time, I'm going to just kind of talk through them. They're pretty simple. So this is a scenario where if a builder is planning construction of a new subdivision, the plan is calling for rerouting a creek around the subdivision. The creek is a floodway, and the plans show the base flood elevations of the creek are not going to increase. So the key word here is the base flood elevations are not increasing. Therefore, they likely will not need a CLOMR, a conditional letter of map revision, and they could proceed with the project, make their updates, and do a letter of map revision once the project is completed. And here's a different scenario where a builder is affecting the flow of the river for a river restoration project and is increasing the base flood elevation of an existing regulatory floodway. This is where they would be required to complete a conditional letter of map revision. They are showing an increase in the base flood elevation, so they need that conditional letter. I'm going to talk through the kind of typical process of how submitting a letter of map revision works. These are definitely, like Ceil mentioned, they're longer processes compared to the letter of map amendment type and MT1 type applications. So first, we're going from left to right here. If you're kind of following along in the slide, the applicant would complete any required paperwork and modeling and supplementary info, which I'm going to go into in detail here soon. That application is submitted to the Minnesota DNR for review. Minnesota has higher standards for floodways as compared to FEMA standards, so we are required to review and then approve that the LOMR meets those higher standards before FEMA can finalize their review. So our recommendation is that we look at that first before you submit to FEMA and sign off on it. And usually we attach a letter saying this meets the Minnesota higher standards and this is what we looked at in our review. And then that application is submitted to FEMA. Reminder that that needs that community acknowledgement form. So the community where the project is happening needs to sign off on the project. And FEMA has to respond within 90 days on the notification of completeness. Typically, that is when you hear a response. It's not usually a lot sooner than that. So these are longer projects because of that kind of lag time between submitting and hearing back from the FEMA reviewer. Any public notice requirements that are required as a part of the project would get completed at this point. And then after the public notice requirements are met, the letter of map revision is issued. There is a fee associated with submitting a letter of map revision and a conditional letter of map revision. The fees range from $6,750 to $9,000 plus, depending on the type of project. And there's the table from the FEMA website there. This is the fee to submit the application, so it doesn't include any cost to prepare the application requirements. And noting also Minnesota DNR does not charge any fee for our higher standards review. This should be taken into consideration when planning projects and LOMRs and CLOMRs. Sometimes the review fees can be waived. A few examples are if the LOMR is not associated with a specific project and it's only based on better data, like updated modeling, really redelineated using LiDAR, or if there was an error in the mapping and you're correcting it. The government-sponsored projects that are intended for flood loss reduction to existing insurable structures, or projects that establish the natural and beneficial floodplain uses may also be exempt. We recommend checking with DNR or FEMA staff to determine if a project is exempt before you get too far along in the process.
When they say government sponsored, I think that's mainly federal, like the Corps of Engineer projects, right?
Yes, I think it's federally funded even, or federally sponsored projects.
Yeah.
So now I'm going to get into talking about what's typically included in a LOMR package. So I link here to the MT2 instructions, and the instructions are actually really helpful, and they go through a lot of what's required. This is a little screenshot of kind of a checklist of what is required from one of the pages. I'll go through some of these checklist items now. All projects should include a project narrative any applicable MT2 forms, and that includes that community acknowledgement form, a certified topographic work map, and an annotated verb. So for the project narrative, typically that just talks about the project background, what the effective mapping is, and what the revision includes and what it is. And then there are forms, form 1 through 6, and it goes through some basic things like what communities are affected, and then the different forms are for specific things. So a couple of the forms are for coastal analysis, which you don't need unless you're on Lake Superior on the coast. And you only do the forms that are applicable for your project. The certified topographic work map is a requirement for all letter of map revision requests, and it needs to include the effective and proposed boundaries, the revision extents, the cross-sections, streamlines, roads, property lines. They want all of the data that's applicable to reviewing a project on here. And it also needs to be certified by a registered professional engineer. This is my certification here, kind of showing like that I signed off on it, and I'm my licensed engineer. And it needs contours, just showing a few of those examples. We also recommend including any digital data from the map with the submittal to with the application submittal. That really helps for reviewers to review all the details. The annotated flood insurance rate map is showing the effective map floodplain, and then you overlay what the proposed floodplain on it is. So this map is a little hard to see, but the dotted is the effective floodplain, and the light blue shade is the proposed floodplain in this scenario. So these are to scale of the original flood insurance rate map, and then you just overlay that proposed on there. Some other applicable items are the hydrologic or hydraulic analysis. Make sure you have a review fee payment if you need it. Any proposed plans or as-built plans are really important for project-based LOMRs and CLOMRs. And then if a public notice is required, that is also included. Typically, like I said in that first kind of overview of the process slide, we see projects that will go through the review with DNR and then FEMA and then send out that public notice. This way, any updates that are resolved during the review can be reflected in the final public notice. The CLOMR applicants are also responsible for documenting that the project has complied with the Endangered Species Act of 1973, and the documentation differs for federal versus non-federal projects. Like Ceil mentioned, I think this is something we want to provide some more guidance on. Essentially, there needs to be statements and background supporting documents saying that the project is complying. So here's an example of what a letter of map revision looks like on the FEMA map service viewer. The blue outline is showing the extents of the LOMR. I'm going to just quickly touch on the physical map revision. I don't have any great pictures for this one, unfortunately. They're more rare. They're typically done when there are a lot of map panels that want to be revised at the same time. And it's similar process to a county-wide mapping process, but it's just not done for quite the entire county. So there have been some of these done. They're just more rare. And yeah, they can include state or FEMA funding to support the process. I'm going to go through a couple resources. I'm going to try and be quick, just so we have some time for questions. Here's the FEMA Flood Map Service Center. You can find the effective products here where it shows 39. Click down on that and it shows you all of the things you can look at for each area. Reminder, we have the FEMA hydraulic model download application. So for LOMRs and CLOMRs, you might want to see the effective, you will need to see the effective model, and you can check if it's on the download viewer. Here's just a snipping of what that looks like. You can search by a county or stream name or an address. Here's links to a couple Minnesota DNR resources if you want to check them out. We've got LFEO there. Ceil showed that a few times in the letter of map amendment slides. Some general info for floodplain management and letter of map changes. And here's links to some of the FEMA resources we talked about today. And I guess I actually didn't mention the online letter of map change is what is used for the LOMRs and CLOMRs as well. Ceil had showed that slide earlier, and that is also how you submit the MT2 application materials to FEMA. Here's a couple other useful FEMA resources.
Yeah, that NFHL site was the one I mentioned is a good one to go in and see existing LOMAs, LOMR-Fs, and you do have to turn on the LOMA layer in there. It's not on in the default. We will be sharing the slides, so those links that Madison's just showing would be available in the slides. Before we get too far away from the LOMRs, I have to mention that, Madison, you showed that timeline, and I have to note that it's pretty rare that FEMA acknowledges all the information within that 90 days and says everything's hunky-dory and issues the LOMR. Usually there's going to be at least one request for additional data. They call it a 8316 letter. And on more complicated questions, you might have 2 or 3 of those additional data requests. And then that starts that 90-day clock for you to submit the information, and then FEMA has another 90 days to review what you submitted.
Yes, definitely. That's a good point, Ceil. The process definitely can expect back and forth is good.
I want to say thanks to everyone for attending today. I hope that it was helpful information. We appreciate folks coming.